Prime Minister Boris Johnson has promised to be, I quote, very generous towards Ukrainian refugees after it emerged that only 50 visas had apparently been granted since the conflict began. Now, I've got to say, confusion persists as to what this 50 number is because it was put out there, then it's kind of been questioned and denied. So I don't think we've really got the true figures. But there's certainly questions about whether or not more will be done to widen the access beyond the current schemes, which require Ukrainians either to have family here in the UK or have a designated UK sponsor for their application. And Home Secretary Priti Patel has said today that she was looking at creating a third humanitarian route for those fleeing the Russian invasion. But again, I think that was questioned because many people were saying it wasn't a third, but it was similar to the second after all. But Lucy Harris, your thoughts on all of this? Because, you know, let's boil it down. Let's ask the question, are we doing enough for refugees fleeing Ukraine?
You know, I think, you know, we're not in normal times. And of course, everybody wants to help them as much as we physically can. I think Michael Gove, he's started thinking about doing some sponsorship visas to speed up this process, and the government is expecting about 200,000 refugees to come to the UK, or at least to apply for visas in the next few months. We're only at the start of this, so obviously 50 visas doesn't seem like a lot right now, and it isn't, but we should be seeing something probably coming through the doors in a few months down the line. But absolutely, you know, I think everybody out there wants to help.
Bang on, a few months down the line, if you're a mom with your kid, desperate trying to get out of Ukraine now, and let's face it, who wouldn't want to get out of there, everything that's going on? Absolutely. You know, a few months down the line, you're not going to be sitting there going, oh, whew, you know, wait for a few months, are you?
No, and that's completely understandable. And I think there is going to be a bigger push, I think, behind the scenes to be able to do this sort of stuff and to be able to make sure that we get as many refugees through the door as possible. I know that obviously some people in government has put it down to security concerns and bureaucracy concerns, and I think that does shed a light onto how we do our sort of our administration here in this country. I think there's too much red tape, and I think there's too much bureaucracy in times of need such as this one.
Laurie, do you think we're doing enough?
No. I mean, this is a European-wide tragedy. There are millions of people will ultimately be forced from Ukraine. All of us have seen the extraordinary suffering on television screens. People across this country, in the way, you know, as they always do, are being generous and donating food and clothing and nappies and millions upon millions of pounds. And that we're hearing these such small figures. I appreciate we may get some more official ones later today, compared to the numbers of people that other European countries are accepting with open arms is a national shame. And I think a lot of people are feeling that right now. It is in the gift of the government to change its rules, to move procedures around so that we can support people from Ukraine to be relocated here, to be looked after. And it is incumbent upon not just countries in mainland Europe, not just the UK, but others around the world to do that. And we're not stepping up to do that at the moment. I think it's shameful.
Do you think it's shameful, our response, Gareth?
Well, I don't really trust Priti Patel on immigration. I think she has quite a jaundiced view of how most people in this country view immigration, and I think she always tends to resort to a more authoritarian approach. That's just my observation over the past year of how Priti Patel's approached this. But having said that, I don't think there are any immigration officials sitting at desks looking at immigration applications from Ukraine and saying, well, no, let's just put that back for a few weeks. I just don't think that's happening. I mean, recently we saw the response to the British state to the Hong Kong situation and taking on enormous numbers of immigrants into the country from Hong Kong. I'm sure this will happen again here. I think Lucy's right. I think there is too much bureaucracy in the system. I think it's a very complex situation. Many Ukrainians don't actually want to leave. Most of them are going into countries such as Poland, where they hope at some point, presumably, to be able to come back again. England is a very distant destination in that sense compared to a lot of European countries. So I think the picture is a lot more complicated, actually, than, again, you used the word virtue signalling before. But I think it is this spat with France over immigration has predated this crisis. If the French Interior Minister has an opportunity to say, look at those Brexiteers on that little island there who will do anything to keep people out, then he will. I think that's the context of this argument. It's not actually to do with the intention of the British system to keep out Ukrainian immigrants.
Yeah, I mean, Laurie, I suspect the flip side of what we're saying here is we're talking about bureaucracy, we're talking about small numbers, we're talking about process. I guess perhaps the flip side, if I'm going to play devil's advocate to this, and I am playing devil's advocate because, like anyone, I watch these images of these mums with their children, and I just want to scoop them all up and get them all to safety. But I guess the flip side to this would be you've got to make sure as well that you're processing people properly, you're doing the right checks and balances to keep the population safe, I guess, would be the argument coming back from the flip side of that. How would you respond to that?
And it's perfectly possible to do that and to accept more people into a country. We see that all around the world. You know, there are lots of wars that have happened at the moment in years gone by, and lots of people have had to flee places. They often want to stay, and many of them do, and suffer in the region that they've been displaced from. But there are mechanisms which countries like the UK can implement where they can still let more people in and have certain checks and balances on the numbers that come in. And there have been many countries that have been torn to pieces by war in recent years, and the regime for letting refugees in has, we've heard this many times from organisations, become harder and harder and harder, created a hostile environment for people coming to the UK. And if people out there are surprised that it's hard for some Ukrainians to come into this country, they're hitting up against the same kind of barriers that have been presented for other people suffering from war.
I don't think that's fair. I don't think that pretty much anyone actually would be hostile to a mom and her child escaping. I mean, I'm showing imagery on the screen now for those of you that are listening on the radio instead of watching. I mean, we're seeing burning buildings, we're seeing their homes being bombed, etc. I don't think anyone would be hostile to mums, children, etc., who want to escape that. I think where the hostility comes from, to quote your word, would be when you've got people that are paying smugglers to get them into the UK as economic migrants. That's what people would be hostile to.
But if I may, it's not necessarily a direct hostility. It's like a bureaucratic hostility. If you're in a situation where you're fleeing war or suffering in your particular country, right, and you've got to fill out reams of forms, you've got to have certain, references you've got to have, and the list goes on and on and on and on. Sometimes those are going above the threshold that we would normally say, OK, there has to be a threshold where that person is clearly fit to be able to come into the country. We're not letting, obvious criminals into the country, right? There is a threshold where you can say, OK, we passed that threshold. And then you can layer on more and more bureaucracy on top of that just to start to deter people indirectly. You're not saying, hey, mum and kid, you're not coming in. You're placing the barrier, you're making the barrier higher and higher and higher for them to jump over to be able to get in. And that has what we've been told this many times by many groups that represent refugees. That barrier has been raised higher and higher as the years have gone on. And it's what's partly happening here, I think.
But Laurie, that's undoubtedly the case. I think you're absolutely right on that. But what I don't understand in this argument is France is presumably saying to the UK, you should be lifting these controls and just taking as many as possible. And in the same breath, the French Interior Minister then goes on to say, but you're not taking your fair share. So he doesn't have to say that bit because France could just admit as many Ukrainian refugees as turn up at the border. He could do that. Why does he have to say to the UK, you're not doing enough? We know why. We know exactly why. It's the B word.
And I won't defend the French government in this case, right? I'm more interested in how we can, irrelevant what French politicians are saying to us, change systems in this country. Because right now people are being exposed to the injustices that we see in that bureaucratic barrier having been raised higher and higher. And now, hopefully, we can talk about how it should be changed that people in these positions can...
I'd absolutely agree with you. I think, in general, how government is run and how we run our society is way too bureaucratic. I think it's so overly complex that ordinary people, not just refugees, but ordinary people in general, almost get a barrier to actually understanding how they can succeed. I mean, even just applying for daily things is incredibly difficult. through government schemes. And I just think it's one of those things that has to be focused on, about diminishing bureaucracy throughout the system. I totally agree with you on that one. That's one I can agree with you on.
Oh, well, there you go. Bureaucracy. Is that what is holding it up? Do we need more bureaucracy or less? Let's cut there to our reporter now, Bradley Harris, to get the latest on his view there. Bradley, good evening to you.
Good evening. Yes, good evening. I'm at the Poland-Ukraine border. Currently behind me there are Polish police guarding one of the main border crossings from Ukraine into Poland. And if we just come around this way, you'll really see the extent to how many Ukrainians are looking to flee their country and enter bordering countries such as Poland, where we are now. You can see security keeping people in place, waiting for the next coach to arrive, and they have been arriving all day, every day for the last 12 days. This isn't just a 9 to 5 operation, this is 24 hours a day, getting people, civilians, out of Ukraine and into places like Poland for safety, for a place to sleep, somewhere to eat, somewhere to drink. And all day this afternoon I've been standing here walking up and down this street. You can see some trolleys in the distance there with food, with clothes. They've been donated by Polish people who are willing to give up what they have for those who now have nothing. Many Ukrainians who have been turning up across the border today have been turning up with only the clothes they have on their back. I've been looking at coaches that have been pulling up, looking up at the window, and there's been people of all ages, older people, younger people, little boys, little girls who are faces pressed against the window, some looking exhausted, tired, because don't forget, for many people, which would normally be a 5 to 6 hour journey from Lviv over to where we are standing now, to the border with Poland, 5 to 6 hours, but actually they've been in the car for 20, 30 hours tops. So for many people it's been an exhausting journey, but for some that journey is almost over.
Goodness me, Bradley Harris, thanks for that update there.